Greetings English 218, Advanced Academic Writing. I'm Mike Tardif, I'll be your instructor. Very quick video here. This is pretty customary. I like to make these mini lectures that give me an opportunity to sort of verbally or orally explain what we're up to and what it means and why we're doing it and all those sorts of things. So anyway, I'm very excited to have you in the class. Looks like we have a pretty big group of students this semester, which is great. That means that we'll be reading and studying a lot of very different and very interesting things. So in week number 1, we're really starting to get the ball rolling already in terms of what many people call information literacy. And by that I mean one of the first things that we're going to tackle is how to effectively read stuff that's sort of above our pay grade. And I don't mean that negatively, and I don't mean that to undermine anybody's intelligence, but the fact of the matter is when we're reading stuff in academic literature, and largely that's what this class is going to be about, you're going to read stuff that's written by experts. And when I say experts, I mean researchers, PhDs, in a particular area who study a very small part of the world and they know it exceptionally or extremely well. And you're going to find that that's largely what comprises the academic literature, are these types of really small slivers of some phenomenon. And you're going to see that with our reading this week. And trust me, I intentionally picked a reading that was esoteric and very difficult. Unless you have a strong background in anatomy and physiology, it's going to be relatively difficult based on the language, based on the methodologies, based on the content, etc. But I do this for a very particular reason, and that is, one, to just sort of reinstill in you, or instill in you for the first time maybe, that it's okay to not understand everything that you're reading. And in fact, as we read more stuff within academic literature, that's largely going to be the case. But part of my job in this class, I think, is to give you a skill set so that you can overcome that initial sort of inertia of trying to read within scholarly journals and other academic literature. And really that's the thing that differentiates this class from probably English 101 and many other writing classes, is that there's a very high expectation or standard for the types of information that we're going to use. In this class, we're not going to use a lot of internet resources unless they're highly vetted and very reputable. We're primarily going to be working within the academic literature, and by that, again, I mean scholarly journals and the like. So it's really important that we have skills to overcome barriers to our comprehension when it comes to reading stuff that's relatively difficult, and I think that's a really important skill set from this class. Of course, part of what else I'm going to teach you is how to find these things, find articles that relate to something that you're interested in or something that you're studying for this class. And that's really one of the cool things, one of the hallmarks of this class, is that by and large you're going to be reading about and writing about things that you're very interested in. So I'm almost never going to tell you what to write about. And so you're going to be following things that are within your domain of interest. So if you're in the health sciences, chances are you're going to pick something related to that topic. If you're in psychology, you're going to pick something related to that topic. If you're in some other social science, you'll pick something in, say, criminal justice. Or if you're in the humanities or whatever, you're going to study whatever it is that interests you. But we're primarily going to be reading the work of experts, and we're primarily going to be working with empirical research, and we'll talk about that later. But as you work through this relatively difficult article, I want to tell you a couple of things that nobody told me until later in my undergraduate career, and I think they're really important, and that is that there are very particular places where you can look within most academic journal articles or most research studies to find key information. And then there are places where you can really start to get bogged down. And I think that once you know that, you'll have a better, more predictable methodology for reading these types of things. So first and foremost, just know that there's sort of a pattern of organization to these types of research studies or articles, and typically it goes introduction, methods, results, analysis, discussion, and conclusion, and some people call that IMRAD. And I can tell you that really a lot of the most important work for us as people who are not researchers trying to replicate these studies or do our own research right now, primarily we're going to focus on the sort of bookends. And by that I mean we're going to read the introduction to sort of understand why this study is being conducted and what the goals are, and we're going to read the discussion section to understand what the results sort of mean, and we're going to read the conclusion to find out what the implications are. The stuff in the middle, I'm not saying it's not important, but a lot of times it's written for, again, people who are occupy a very small sliver of the world, who are studying the exact same thing and who want to replicate the study or build upon that study. Particularly that's true of the methodology section, and that's where you're going to find a lot of the language that becomes cumbersome, because we're talking about very specialized ways of studying something. Sometimes it's some statistical process, sometimes it's some very specific lab procedure, sometimes it's a very particular theoretical framework that the researchers are using. And again, I don't want to say that it's not important, but those are not the most important things typically for us as people who are trying to sort of put into context the results and the findings of a particular study with other studies. And that's, and we'll work on that as the semester goes. So don't get bogged down in the methodology section. And the results section can be equally troubling because of the ways that various, and again, this will vary depending on what types of research you're reading. The results sections can also be very technical and very laden with data and presentations of data and interpretations of data. And the language can, again, become sort of a barrier. So I want you to feel liberated to sort of really look at the two bookends. Read the introduction, try to understand the goals and the scope of the study. Try to understand to some level what the methods are. You don't have to know them like the back of your hand, but you should know, was it a survey? Was it a set of interviews? Were they using, what kind of data set were they using? So you should know that at sort of a really basic level, and then you should know what the results sort of told the researchers, and then you should certainly know what the implications are. And so it's totally okay when you're reading this type of literature, unless you're trying to replicate the study, to sort of understand it from a 50,000-foot view. You don't have to really get bogged down in the minutia, and that's totally okay. Now, of course, if you're in another class, and that's sort of the domain of the class, is to really zoom in on things and understand things, then of course, that changes the sort of context. But for the purposes of this class, you should feel comfortable. And one of the best things about scholarly literature, there's lots of signposts, and there are structural things within these documents that allow us to scan and skim. And I want you to feel okay doing that. Skimming and scanning is fine. In fact, most people that I know that regularly read within their field and read the literature, they're not reading word for word, top left-hand corner to bottom right-hand corner sequentially every page. They're skimming and scanning, and they're trying to find very particular pieces of information, and that's also okay. But when you finish reading an academic article or study, you should know a few things. You should know what the researchers' goals were or what their research questions were. You should know at some basic level what they were trying to find out. You should know what they found out, and you should know what the implications are. And those four guiding questions, if you can answer those questions with some confidence, then you're doing it right and you're doing it well. And I think that you'll find that that's easier than trying to sort of internalize and understand everything that the article is telling you. And that's really one of the main sort of outcomes of these first couple of weeks, is to just sort of make ourselves more comfortable with reading stuff that's relatively difficult. And again, I can't stress enough that these articles are not written for you and I. They're written for a very small audience of people who study the exact same thing. And one of the things that people don't realize is that scholarly journals, while there are some very large ones like the journal Science and the journal Nature, and there are some that cast a relatively wide net, there are journals that are very, very narrow in their scope and in their focus. And so the audience for those is equally narrow, and the people who write for them are very specialized, and they have a very specialized vocabulary, they have a very specialized way of seeing the world, they have a very specialized training. And so it really makes logical sense that we don't always have access to what they're trying to say, and we can't understand it maybe in the most comprehensive level. But that should not restrict us from trying to understand what they were doing, how they did it, what they found, and what it means. And those are really the four guiding questions. I like to use the example, for instance, that there is a journal called Ursus, and it literally just reports research focused on bears. So the biology of bears. So if you're a bear researcher, you're probably trying to get your work published in Ursus, and that's a very narrow scope, and it's primarily read by other people who work in bear biology. Which again, you can imagine there are not many people who do that. And that's why it becomes difficult to understand. Of course, there are people out there who study very specific diseases or very specific treatment modalities or whatever it is, or very specific genres of writing if we're talking about the humanities. And so that's why these things become relatively difficult to read, is because there's an understanding that if you're reading this, you are equally specialized in your training and your understanding of that thing. And I want you to feel okay that you're not always going to have that. Now, over time, as you develop some level of expertise in an area or some specialization, that vocabulary and that reading process is obviously going to become a little bit more natural for you, but it's completely okay at this point to not internalize or comprehend everything that's being thrown at you in these articles. The important thing, and you'll see this as we move through the semester, is just to acclimate yourself to as many of these studies as possible, because then we get to see sort of what the field is telling us or what the emerging research is telling us about a particular thing. I picked this article, for instance, the one that you're reading about caffeic acid, because I've heard so much conflicting research about the health benefits of wine. And so, 1 week on the news you'll hear that it's terrible for you and that you should avoid it at all costs, or that even one glass, a night is really bad. And then other times you hear that it has, cardioprotective qualities. And so I was interested in that. And so, if you were in, say, healthcare, or you had an emerging interest in working in cardiology, for instance, this may be a literature that you'd want to familiarize yourself with to really understand what we know about this topic. And one of the things that you'll find in this class is that science is really messy. There are long-held beliefs that often, or paradigms that get shifted or shattered, and we'll see that. And we'll see that there are many conflicting sort of interests and pressures that form science and form knowledge, and that's one of the really interesting things. And that's why I think it's so important to be able to stay up to date and abreast of the research that guides what we do and what we recommend and decisions that we make and those types of things. So I'm really glad to have you in the class. I don't want you to freak out because this reading is really difficult. I can promise you for the rest of the semester you'll be reading stuff that's much more interesting to you. But I sort of wanted to prove an experiential point that even when you're reading something that is maybe outside of your domain or above your pay grade, you can still glean something from it if you are resourceful. And I'm interested to hear how people made it through this article. If you're resourceful and if you're willing to look in the right places and not get bogged down in the places that we know are sort of quagmires or are problematic. And I can tell you, usually that's the methodology and the results section. If we just focus on the introduction, the discussion, and the conclusion, we'll get a pretty good sense of those 4 questions. What the researchers did and why they did it, how they did it, so what sort of methods they deployed to understand this thing, what they found, and what it means. And if we get a sense for that, we're in a pretty good spot. As we move along, we'll start to talk about other things, how to critically engage with this research, to find out more about the researchers, to find more about the body of research, to find out more about the publications that are publishing this stuff, because those are not all created equally. We like to think that, and you've probably been told this, that the gold standard of information is scholarly journals, but even within that sort of genre or in that publication platform, there are tiers. There's sort of a hierarchy. Some are top tier, some are lower tier, some have a larger impact, and we'll get to that. But that's how we need to critically engage with this information, so that, again, if we're trying to make a decision in a clinical setting, or if we're trying to make some recommendation, or we're trying to make some decision, which many of you will have to make in your lives and in your careers, we want to have the best, most reliable, most valid information at our fingertips. I'll leave you with this. If you need any help in this class, all you have to do is call, text, or email, and I'll be there to help you. This is a challenging class, but I think it's going to be a very rewarding class, and I have no doubt that it will change the way that you understand how knowledge is produced and made, and I think it's going to make you a more critical consumer of that information. So, okay, I was a little bit longer than I thought. It's about 13 minutes, but have yourselves a really nice Thursday, and let me know how I can help. Take care.